I will be doing the empirical work as well, as correctly as I can. And then I will be crafting it in a way that, because when you work, it's sort of like preparing food. You have to serve it to someone. They have to want to eat it. I was depicted by the Nobel Committee as a historical detective, and that really is the way I think of my work. When we usually think about the gender gap today, we think about earnings. The book, Understanding the Gender Gap, was written to set down the history of women in the labor force. So in that sense, the gender gap of the title is not so much about earnings as it is about labor force participation, about what we call the extensive margin, which is whether you're in the labor force or not, whether you decide to do that, and also the intensive margin. But until the 1930s and 40s, we didn't have a clear definition of what we meant by being in the labor force or not in the labor force.
Like so many people these days, we live in the suburbs, and Dave needs the car every day for business. When he was gone, I was practically a prisoner in my own home. I couldn't get out to see my friends, couldn't take part in PTA activities. I couldn't even shop when I wanted to. But that's all changed now.
If you look back to 1900, a very, very small fraction of women are in the labor force, let's say 5%. But today, it's, let's say, 70%. Well, that's a huge change. I knew that I was doing something extremely important. But at the same time, I thought, how is it possible that if I look back to 1900, people were poor? Surely the women were employed for more than that, more than 5% of women. We know it's higher for Black women. So this would have been white women. What about immigrant women? What about industrial homework? What about doing laundry and for other people? What about being a boarding house keeper? And so I started thinking about the fact that there was a vast undercount of employment and that I should go and put people back into the labor force, even though they didn't say that they had an occupation. Well, why didn't they say they had an occupation? Because that wasn't something that they did all the time. It wasn't as if they went to work at 8 o'clock in the morning and came back at 6 o'clock and worked 6 or 5.5 days a week. They were essentially working at home. And so they didn't consider the fact that they had an occupation. It may also not have been considered appropriate to say that. So then I began to look farther and further back in American history and getting sources and trying to understand what women actually did that would have gotten included in gross national product. So we're not talking about childcare. We're not talking about cooking at home or washing dishes or cleaning the home. We're talking about making products and services that would ordinarily get included in gross national product. What I discovered is something that Esther Boserup and some others had thought about before, which is that in actuality, women's employment in the paid labor force that should have been included in gross national product, even if they themselves weren't remunerated for it, actually is U-shaped. So it's higher when the home and the market are one, when people have family farms, when people have family firms. Women are in the labor force a lot more, but we don't necessarily measure that. And then as the market expands, as larger firms draw individuals from the home into the labor market, it's the men who leave first and the women are at home. So then it sort of goes down, and probably the min point is around the 1920s. It was even more interesting because it wasn't as if the data that we had were telling us the truth about what happened to women in the labor force.